move on over to our employer insight. So we're going to now welcome to the virtual stage Laura Looney, and joining us is Tracy Zimmerman from Robots and Pencils. So thank you both so much for joining us. And I think it's important for Laura to introduce herself because you have some pretty amazing experience in this space. And then we'll kick it over to Tracy to tell us a little bit about Robots and Pencils before we start our conversation.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Stephanie. I'm simply a member of the emerging standards for credentials group that has been sort of a think tank since we met, or since we joined up at the Wicked Problems Shaping EDU last July. So yeah, and I do absolutely have some questions for Tracy Zimmerman of Robots and Pencils, but where I'm coming from is I've been in higher education and specifically the humanities for 33 years, I think it is 34 years. I'm at a pretty traditional university in Portland, Oregon, which means we're adverse to change. And I wear a lot of curricular hats, so I'm involved in a lot of curricular design projects, and so I'm very very much an advocate for change, but I'm always, always with an eye to the institutions that may just need a little more support, adopting change and adapting to it. Thank you.
Excellent. So Tracy, thank you so much for joining us. Good to see you.
Nice to see you too. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be on the stage with some of these great educators and contributors to disrupting the way that we help unlock opportunity for students and employers.
Excellent. And I think it was so important for us to involve you in this conversation because as the leader of Robots and Pencils, which is a leader in the digital innovation space, it has to be, both critical and challenging to keep everyone upskilled and find the right people to get around the table. So with that, I'll let you tell us a little bit about Robots and Pencils, and then Laura can walk us through some questions.
Yeah, Stephanie, thank you. I mean, you're right about the innovation stuff, but also one of the things about, really running a professional services company, especially in this more innovative space, is you get a very unique perspective, right? So you see a lot. And so hopefully I can help to contribute to the conversation in that regard. But who we are, Robots and Pencils uses cutting edge technology and design, which is really the kind of the premise behind our name. So the technology team members we call robots. So they're developers, engineers, and they're focused on really bringing the scientific side of the brain or the mind or the solution into the work we do with clients, and then bringing the design side together. And that's what we call the pencils. So those are the people who do like UX and design, and those are really our humanities people that are doing more of the, call it human side of the change, to help make sure that change is adopted, to make sure we have great user experiences, to make sure that these engineers don't build great scalable technology, but then the screens are too hard to use. And then on the vice versa side, you don't want great designers building out great experiences, but then it's really slow or it crashes when your 100th user logs on. So by working together in that regard, we work to help drive business impact for our clients using those cutting edge tools. We build digital products with our clients. We build across many different platforms and tools. So going back to your point of like, do we have to keep our knives sharp? You better believe it. But the good thing is there's also a lot of baked in learning, just even being part of the organization. So we use a lot of different platforms and tools. So we build custom mobile apps, we build web apps, we build Salesforce and Slack apps. We also work really hard, and I would argue this is just as important, in partnership with our clients to make sure the work we're doing is the right work, that'll be a high impact. And, we take an iterative approach to finding the right solution. And in fact, it's okay if you have an idea, if you're not sure if it's the right idea yet, but kind of iterating along the way, kind of staging things through. Because sometimes along that way, by being open-minded and not feeling like, yeah, we definitely know what we want, you often will find a different opportunity along the way. You know, it always feels like it's okay for like startups to pivot like 80 times, but inside of like the enterprise, it's like, oh, you changed what you're working on. It's like, well, yes, that's, you know, we got new information, so we want to change our mind. So we really work in partnership with our clients to help them to be able to do that, so that we can have, you know, ultimately the impact and the return on the work we're doing. So we're really fortunate to work with a lot of great clients, really, really grateful for all of you, including ASU, who's an awesome client for us in the education space. We also work with clients in a number of other industries. We've got quite a bit in education, as well as in financial services and in consumer and retail goods. But I kind of have this joke saying, like, I think we've worked on at least one project for every single industry, right? The company's 12 years old now. We were very early, particularly in mobile, and it was kind of like, we don't know anything about your industry, but we know a lot about mobile. We're like, perfect, let's pair up and build something. But as the years have gone by, we've verticalized a little bit more. So it's like I said, you get to learn a lot. You have no choice but to learn a lot also.
Great. May I go to the first question, Tracy?
Sure, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, so you know, we just heard from two students, and we've heard about learner earners, and of course we're talking about micro credentials. I'm going to fold two questions into one, and thinking about, you know, how you hire and your hiring priorities. Does Robots and Pencils require a 4-year degree? And in terms of badges and micro credentials, for your company specifically, what do you find to be most challenging or problematic?
So many of our team members do have 4-year degrees, but we don't necessarily require it. We do mostly hire more senior people. So right now, our current model is a little bit of like special ops, right? So we come in with a certain level of seniority. It's actually, as the business grows, something that we would like to solve, to be able to bring in, you know, less senior talent and give them more opportunity. But team members per se don't have to have a bachelor's or, you know, a degree. It really depends, because we hire a breadth of roles. For example, if we're hiring a data scientist, they're probably going to have at least a bachelor's, probably a master's, maybe a PhD. On the flip side, you know, there are a lot of great programs out there and learning opportunities where people, for example, might learn UX or design, you know, from a different type of program, whether it's a boot camp, or we also give people the opportunity to kind of cross bridges and learn once they're here.
Right.
And so I think we're flexible in that regard, and we are more focused on, you know, what people can do, and, you know, the experience they've had necessarily than their education experience. I will say, and I think that my experience reflects the experience of a lot of employers, is the discovery space is relatively immature here, right? So, and I say this as somebody that before I came to RMP, I was in education for 7 years. So, I mean, I know it from the inside. So I'll try to speak as if I don't know as much as I do, but it's a crowded market. And so earlier stage, when you're doing like recruiting, sometimes it can be hard to say, well, what does this credential even mean, right? This person has, like, one of the pros of a degree, and I'm not even saying it's necessarily true, but in our minds, we think we know what it means when people have a bachelor's degree in, you know, computer science or something like that, right? And so I think that, you know, that's one of the problems that's to be solved. But, you know, we are in a market where it's very, very competitive for talent. We are recruiting people, and we're also willing to take the time to look at those less traditional sort of credentials, portfolios, references. And I do think that, like, I think we can have really great people with traditional education. I think we also have awesome people that, like, you know, I have a guy who's like one of my best Salesforce people. He's a film studies major. Like,
right.
how? Why? I mean, he has a traditional degree, but it's not in the space. So I think that everyone's just sort of trying to figure out how to simplify their job so that there's an outcome that's meaningful to employers, if that makes sense. But I think we're very open to it for sure.
Yeah, I really enjoyed exploring your website. It's a beautiful website, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
And
yeah, the pencils.
What's that? Yeah, the pencils.
I saw the pencils. Yeah.
Give credit to the pencils. Exactly. There was one quote that really struck me, and I think you could speak to it again for job seekers. And the quote is that 85% of the jobs available in 2030 currently do not exist. So what advice would you have for job seekers and keeping that context in mind.
Yeah, no, it's totally crazy. When I first read that statistic, even I was like, oh my gosh, I feel like we know the speed of change keeps going faster and faster, but to see something like that, and I'm in the stage of life where I have kids that are, high school, college age, whatever. And so I get these questions a lot.
Yeah,
I think it is kind of like, I mean, and it has a direct impact on my return on investment. But anyway, I think that part of it is, there's fundamental skills, right? So I do kind of have some advice that's semi-general. One thing is, trying to figure out what you're good at and what your strengths are, whether you take more formalized tests or you talk to friends or mentors so that you can kind of get a general idea. I do think it's important, especially early in your career, like for the students on the call, to develop some expertise in something, right? Learn to be good at something. Like for me, early on, I was a developer. And by the way, I never got my degree and I taught myself. So I have a lot of edupunk in my DNA as well. But, I developed that skill set. I became good at it. So, and then along the way, the other piece to really look at is how do you learn to learn? Because like those jobs are changing all the time, right? So really, if you have to pick one skill, learning to learn is one of the most important things that you can have. And just knowing like, hey, don't get too attached to whatever you're working on because it's going to change. It may get automated, new tools will come out. You may have a new opportunity. But I also think the other thing to think about is, as you develop whatever that initial expertise is too, it's how you show up to work and how, you work with your colleagues that ultimately matters a lot. Like one of the things is early in your career, I think you say yes to almost everything, right? It's a learning opportunity. You always want to help other people. You do people a lot of favors. Because a lot of times that takes you outside of like your normal day to day. Like I was a developer, but somebody from marketing asked me to help with something and I learned a bunch about their job, right? I'm like 22 or something. And now I still know that stuff.
Mhm.
Obviously, as you get further in your career, you have to start saying no a lot more, but that's not what we're talking about today. And so I think that that's the other thing is like really kind of developing, you've got a skill set, you're using it to help your teammates. And then the last thing I would say is asking good questions and understanding how does this business I work for make money? That seems like really obvious, or how does it serve its customers or whatever? It seems like obvious advice, but I have found in my career, it's not, right? And then so people don't always understand because they get buried in some, department, right? And they don't really understand how what they do ties into serving, ask questions of people until someone tells you how the work you're doing helps to serve your customers, because it's important for you to start to understand how the business actually works. And it helps you because then you can think about the problems and you can come up with ideas because you've got a different background than anybody else who works with you, right? Every person's unique and can bring something to the table.
Well, it does sound like you cultivate a real culture of mentoring at Robots and Pencils. I wasn't going to go there, and I'm just going to make that an aside, a word of praise. But you did hit on something when you were talking, Tracy, about adaptability, I guess, and change, and the employee needing to, be flexible. And a question might be for a college graduate, how long can the college graduate taking on a new job, how long can that college graduate expect to stay in a role? I mean, are we in this accelerated landscape now where roles are just sort of, it reminds me of when so out of college, I moved to Seattle, and Starbucks was just getting going, right?
Oh, nice.
And they were opening, and I should have gotten a job at Starbucks.
And you guys are still working with Starbucks.
What? Yeah, right.
ASU is still
Good point.
Anyway.
Yeah. So no, but I had an architect friend who was responsible for designing the interiors, as and it was just there were so many stores going up. I mean, it was just so exponential that every day he'd go to work and he didn't know what was going to be on his plate or how his actual role was going to change. Like, what are my duties today? So that's the question. Yeah. What could you tell the college graduate about the rapid change in the workplace?
It's hard with college grads because I want to give like two kind of contradictory pieces of
Mhm.
advice. One is be patient, and the other one's sort of like be aggressive, right? You're not going to become the director of the department at the end of your 9th month of your first job.
Good.
But that said, I think whether somebody's senior in their career or just starting out, invariably people call me all the time for advice. I'm not totally sure why. And I will not decide for you, but I'll give you advice. But the thing I consistently say to people is go to the job where you're going to learn the most, where more things will pass by you. And actually, I have to credit Seth Godin because he said something similar a long time ago, but it's like, so it's not necessarily about how long they'll stay in the role, because it depends on the role. There's some roles that like you could probably master it in like 3 months. And there's other roles, like I'll say mine, for example, I feel like I'll never master it. It's always changing. And so I think it's better to think about, are you being exposed? Are you learning, like your friend you were talking about at Starbucks, or have you already sort of, mastered what you're doing? And then it doesn't mean you have to quit, right? A lot of times the employers are busy or whatever. They might just be like, hey, it's quiet over there. It's
Yeah,
good. But actually saying like, hey, listen, I've got this handled, is there something else I could do? Volunteering for a special project and stuff, because it is actually really valuable, to start to, whatever your purview is, start to understand the business, especially if you've been asking those questions I advised people to earlier, you're thinking about the business, then you can bring wherever you were, your domain expertise, that department or whatever you're working in, perhaps into a broader context. So I think that's way more important than putting it on a timeline, if that makes sense, right? Because there's some
Yeah,
jobs like it takes a
yeah.
really long time to learn them and they change all the time. And then there's some that should frankly be automated, right? So you can move on. So maybe you could suggest that to your boss. Hey, look, I think that this piece looks really, something that could be automated. Maybe there's platforms out there. And,
Mhm.
worst case scenario, you get known as somebody who has ideas and is willing to raise your hand.
Stephanie, did you have any questions? I have one more that's very close to my heart, but Stephanie, did you have any questions for
Go
Tracy?
ahead and ask it, and then I have a follow-up question. So yes,
Great.
go ahead, Laura.
The question close to my heart has to do with humanities, because I'm in the humanities. I'm a Spanish professor. That's what I really am.
I know.
So yeah, and I do a lot of project-based learning and digital literacy. We're constantly building digital media in the classroom, even starting in Spanish 101. And I should just say right now they're making TikTok videos and they're going to go up live and they're
Of
going to
course they are.
comment, and that's their final exam. They're
Yeah.
making how-to tutorials in Spanish 102, which is pretty amazing, right? So here's the question about humanities, because micro credentials, we've heard about skills, we've heard about behaviors. We've also heard about trust, I guess, and credibility. I want to say that a problem right now in higher education and for the job market is that student enrollment in the humanities is declining. We know, you and I, Tracy, know, and many people here know that there are many, many skills in the humanities, like the film studies employee that you have, many skills that are so valuable, right, to employers in the humanities. So my question is, what are those skills that you identify in the humanities that are, the added value
Mhm.
to the learners' job prospects, right? So the learners on the job market, and how do we sort of make visible those soft skills, and how do we advocate for them in the first place? I mean, that's something I'm trying to do all the time inside this institution, but I'd love to hear your perspective on the other end, right? When you work with people coming out of the humanities. Thank you.
Well, going back to your question, and the premise of the company is that we're the humanities and the sciences. I actually believe the beauty is bringing them together, whether it's an individual who's had good exposure to both, whether it's you're great at humanities, I'm great at sciences. We figured out how not to be oil and water, but instead to be salad dressing, I guess, make something, we couldn't make individually. I guess I would say, I'll start with sort of the applicant. You have a humanities degree, you're looking for a job. ultimately it's always going to be on you to position yourself, right? So kind of I have similar advice to what I have to somebody who is, once they're in a job, which is understand how the job and the role that you're applying for, how do you position what you've known and learned? Like, you got to make it easier for the employer. They're your customer in this regard, right? That's something that humanities people will say, like, put the customer at the center. And so you sometimes with a degree like that may have to connect the dots for the employer to say, well, yeah, I was a history major, right? But you should really hire me as, your web content SEO specialist because I'm a great researcher. I'm a great writer. I'm actually really detail oriented and organized. I mean, I'm making stuff up about history majors, but, to parlay the skill set you've learned, I will say to step up a level, I think where the institutions can help, and there's a lot of interesting tools that are out there being built, is to help understand that cross-pollination. A lot of times the students don't know, employers don't know, students don't know. So you have this really educated population, you have all these open jobs. That seems to me unbelievably dumb, right? Like that there's this big gap. And I know all these skills programs and stuff, like we're trying to solve it, right? Because on the flip side, maybe that same student needs to go like do one of those Google credentials on SEO and then articulate, and then they're able to, connect the dots. So I think as institutions, as partners, as employers, we can try to look at what are those sort of discovery tools on the employer side, and then tools for students on the other side that would help them understand and connect what they've learned to the market, because there could be a skills gap, right? Just because you're in love with history and want to study it, like, somebody who applies with a history degree from one of my jobs is probably be like, okay, what, keep going, like, tell me more, right? They're going to have to help to articulate the role. And so I think also, having those conversations with career services and others, creative thinkers that can help. I think it's actually a competitive advantage to be an employer that can think outside the box. I think I am one of those people, by the way, that's able to see, people develop skills in different ways. And it could be through jobs, it could be through training, it could be through reading, it could be through helping with their family business. Like there's all kinds of ways that people develop those skills. And so I think that that's ultimately the issue. And I also think institutions, I love these programs that are putting together cross sections of different majors. I love it so much. And by the way, I also love your TikTok idea, because even if you've got the humanities team and they're working with scientists, because by nature, a lot of times those people are going to be like, you guys are weird, right? But if they work together on a project, which obviously about project-based learning, you can co-develop it with another professor, right? Who's in a science curriculum. And that's also it's a lot closer to the real world. Sorry, education, but all these assignments, the closer you can get to something that's in the real world, there's nothing that we work on that doesn't involve both. Nothing. I can't think of anything. Maybe really low level engineering details or something, or really high level visual design, but mostly they're working together. You have a designer designing something that cannot be built by a developer. You cannot have a developer, building stuff out, not thinking about the end user experience, just in my business. Right. But I think that's true in business in general. So anyway, that's a little bit, I guess you got me a bit on a podium on that one.
Well, you're speaking, I think, you're speaking my language, and or we're speaking the same language, and yeah, and it's absolutely illuminating. Thank you so much.
And Tracy, as a follow-up to that, I wanted to ask you how, as you're considering candidates for a position, what to you, if we're looking at badges and skill specific hiring, and what to you speaks to grit and perseverance and tenacity and resilience? There's not a badge for that. So how do we actually communicate that we have those things, especially as we're looking potentially at algorithms doing a lot of that work for us? What would you suggest that we factor into that process?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question, because as somebody who never did finish my degree, and some of you know me well enough to know that I am extremely gritty. I was always offended because people would say, well, if you finish your degree, it shows you can complete something. I'm not saying it doesn't show that. I'm just saying there are other ways to show that you can complete something. So I do think it's a really interesting kind of problem opportunity. It's an interesting question, because I think it's a subliminal thing you look for. You're not like, okay, let me look at this resume and see what I think about grit, but then you do kind of look for it. Mm-hmm. And, I think a lot of times, length of term with an employer / complexity of assignment, like my bias, and I'm afraid this is going to come back to bite me, generally speaking, when I see somebody who's been somewhere really long, not robots and pencils, I'm like, they've been somewhere too long. But if I see that somebody has taken the time, like if they have had different roles, or, and it doesn't have to be promotions, right? But they're doing different projects. Like I was suggesting, okay, you've matured in this role, now go help with a special initiative or something like that. And they take the time to articulate that into the resume. That says something about the person, right? That they're a hard dryer, which is kind of what a grit person is, that they recognize that, you know, they're trying to make my life easier as someone who's trying to hire them, not make me connect the dots. So I think that's one way. I think obviously a grueling, you know, program academically for sure is one of the ways, right? So I'm not down on it. I think it's silly when people think it's the only way. I also think there's volunteer experience that can show that. You know, you see somebody like maybe the Peace Corps, or they did some kind of like mission to wherever for 6 months or a year, and you're kind of like, that was probably character building. And I do like, so one of the things I like about LinkedIn is that you can put those other experiences on there. As far as a digital credential that shows grit, I mean, I don't know, what do you guys think that would look like? It's kind of weird, right? Because, you know, or I guess the other things could be like if they started a business and maybe felt, I don't think it's bad when people, generally speaking, have a lot of job changes. I'm like, what's going on here? I think in those situations, you should say what happened. Like if somebody started a business in a folder, I mean, it sounds kind of crazy, but I don't think it'd be the worst thing to say in LinkedIn. The employer's already going to be like, why were you there for 6 months? You might as well just put in there, we tried this business model, it didn't work. You know, this was a new role for me. I got in over my head and I learned X, Y, Z. You know, I look at LinkedIn a lot, so you can tell that from my answers. So maybe if there's a way, I don't know. I think it's a bit of an unsolved problem. It's hard for me to think of a credential, frankly, that would seem legit. You know what I mean? It just seems kind of like, well, yeah, I read her book. I read Angela Duckworth's books. Okay. You know, I guess you could have in that little bio, like other sections, you could write about like, I know things are hard. Maybe I trained for marathon type things. Those would be like more obvious because they take a lot of time. I don't know. What do you guys think? You hire people too.
I think that that's part of the danger of letting the algorithm take over from
Sure.
you know, an employer HR standpoint. Yes, you can find people that have checked boxes, but there still has to be that layer of sussing someone out and making sure that they have all those soft skills that you're looking for. So it's a challenge, and I think it'll become more challenging for a candidate to clearly articulate before you meet someone in person for an interview that you have those soft skills. And how do you do that? That's a question we'll ask to Lori when we from LinkedIn when we chat a little bit later. But I think that'll continue to be a bit tricky.
Well, the people in chat are suggesting the endorsements. I actually think those are great. If you can get somebody to write and endorse, and if I think somebody demonstrates that, because I do value it as a hiring manager, you can go and look at my LinkedIn endorsements I've written. I will write that. I'll say if a problem's really hard, but someone's going to figure out how to pull off this event with short notice, you should hire Stephanie. Right. Like, and so I do, you know, it's sort of giving back. We're also human beings, right? We ought to be looking to give back to people, especially if they've impressed us in that regard. And especially if it's something that's hard to show in the resume, you know, or the profile or whatever. So that's an interesting, Justin was the one that suggested that. And I think it's kind of the best way there is today.
Definitely.
I would just sum that up as, you know, humanizing all processes. We're talking about humanization, and it's very,
and that's going to always be the hardest part. It will always be the hardest part. And I do think technology is coming a long way. Stephanie, I think the algorithms and the screening and stuff, I believe that cuts both ways, right? We're using some tools and stuff that are doing blind candidate searches and things like that. So we don't have any sort of unconscious bias in like our recruiting process. So we've done some things like that. I think there's a lot to be done, you know, there. So I don't know, technology is designed by robots and pencils people, right? By humanities people and by scientists. And that's another way that humanities people thinking through those things and the outcomes, Laura, can really help to make sure that as we build those products, we're thinking about what's the human impact to this, not just user experience, but what are the ethical considerations? How can we design that in?
Exactly. It is about ethics. It's absolutely, and I believe, well, I mean, ethics is a soft skill that I'm going to be advocating. We're known for ethics at the University of Portland, and I'm going to be advocating for, you know, threading it very visibly through students' lives here so that they can articulate that skill to others. But this has been awesome. And I do believe robots and pencils, reading your website and that sort of commitment to the user experience is what commits you to this humanizing effect or effects that we're talking about. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate it very much. And thank you for your hard work in progressing these initiatives.
Mhm.